Welcome, my dear students of class 11, to this English class with me, your tutor, Chekhov. Today, our topic is called The Malefactor by Anton Chekhov. So, Anton Chekhov was born in 1860 and he died in 1904. He is a Russian playwright, which means he writes drama, and he's a famous one at that. And he is a modern writer who writes about the modern social issues. In fact, he was very much impacted by the 19th century realism. So what is realism? Realism is portraying the reality of the society or the world through arts. So that's what we have here. And he is a seminal figure, which means he is a very influential, he has impacted the modern literature art a lot. So that's what we have here in our author. And this lesson, The Malefactor, is originally written in Russian language and translated into English. Now we are going to take a look at the lesson here. So when we look at the topic, the malefactor, what or who is a malefactor? A malefactor is a person who has committed a crime or an offender. So that's what we have here, and let's take a look at the setting. The setting here is Russian Empire during the second half of the 19th century, and it took place in a village called Klimov peasants. In fact, it has to do with the village people of Klimov peasants. And the actual place took place in the courtroom. So today we are going to a courtroom and we are going to witness how a case is being solved, and that's what we are going to take a look at. So let's imagine that we are in a courtroom as audience and listen to this case and think about whether justice was being served or not. So in order to take a look at the case or the plot, let's briefly discuss the plot here. It started with Dennis, that is the malefactor or the culprit, who was summoned to the court because he was caught unscrewing a nut. So a nut is a metal head that is used to fasten things, and we usually noticed it in the door frame that has to be attached to the wall. So that is a nut. So his crime was that he was caught unscrewing a nut at a railway track, and that was considered a crime. So he was caught by a watchman and beaten up, and he was reported to the court. That's why he was being summoned. So the story opened with the courtroom session, the magistrate trying to bring out the evidence of his crime and convict him. So that's what we have here. However, the plot, that is the rising action, the plot is very complex in nature. Why? Because so many things happen in between that lead up to the climax. We have a lot of humor and satire, and in fact Anton Chekhov is using a lot of satire in order to drive home his point. What is a satire? A satire is an attack or a criticism on the social natures or the social evils or issues. So that's what we have here, and a lot of humor as well, because naturally a satire uses a lot of humor, and the humor happens in the story. Why? Because this peasant or Dennis has no clue why he was being brought there and why he could not understand why he has to be made an offender for unscrewing a nut. So that's what we have here, and a lot of miscommunications also or misunderstanding also took place here because of the failure on the part of the defendant Dennis, who is not able to understand that he had committed a crime. On the other hand, we have a magistrate who is trying to simply look at the facts and the evidence in order to convict him. So that led up to the climax, and the verdict was that the judgment was that he was being convicted and he was sentenced to imprisonment. And the story stops there. Why? Because the writer Anton Chekhov is trying to put across to the reader to decide for themselves whether it is justice or whether justice was being served or not. So it is up to you, the reader, to decide. So that's what happened. So that's why in our plot here we have no resolution. Now, let's take a look at what exactly happened in that courtroom. And in order to understand it, we need to understand the character. So the protagonist, if you would wish to say, Dennis, is a little poor peasant, and he's a fisherman, and his description was that he was wearing a striped t-shirt. He was wearing a striped t-shirt and patched trousers or pants, and he was barefooted. He appears very shaggy, dirty, and that's what we have here in the description. So that tells us the description of a peasant here, a very poor person who has to make a livelihood by or through fishing. So that's what we have here. And interestingly, he has a very loose tongue. So in the court session, what happened is that even though his certain stories are not related to the case at all, he goes on talking and talking, and eventually that happens because he has also reflected a lot of what the circumstance of a peasant was like in that century, that is the 19th century. And through that loose tongue of his, a lot of comic elements were also revealed. You know, he is the defendant here, the culprit, but he's questioning the magistrate. What's that? When he was shown the nut, and acting as though, or pretending as though he has never seen one. And on being inquired whether that was the nut, the evidence, whether that was the nut that was also caught when he was unscrewing, brought to the court when he was unscrewing the nuts from the rail track. And he, again, the miscommunication took place here. Why? Because you know, if you think about it, nuts, you cannot really identify this is this and that is that, you know. So he again misled into thinking, and he gave a lot of other examples where his nuts are being hidden. So he also told us a lot about, from his perspective, we learned that the village people, everyone, in fact, almost everyone is involved in that, committing that crime. They go and unscrew nuts from the rail track, which is a very harmful thing, or a very dangerous thing to do, because it will cause accident. And again, he is not able to understand the gravity of the situation here. Why? Because in Article 1081, it says that anyone who intentionally brought injury would be injury to the rail tracks and causes an accident, the punishment would be imprisonment. So again, he goes on defending himself, saying that I'm not educated. You are the one who is educated, you know. So that kind of a situation, that kind of a communication that took place creates a lot of humor in the story. And we find that the magistrate has, in fact, he also called him, or Dennis, as an idiot, a donkey. So that is again a reflection of the hierarchy here. Here is a peasant and here is a magistrate who has authority. We are also, in other words, talking about the social hierarchy and whether law is being justified, or whether law is favorable to the poor or the rich. Now let's take a look at the magistrate. So a magistrate is a person who is a civil officer and who usually presides over petty crimes such as small crimes. So that's why he is presiding over that session. And he, if we look at the story here, he is a law enforcer. He is the one who is only looking at the facts and evidence. He read out the Article 1081. So that's why we can say that he is a law enforcer. He is very educated, as Dennis pointed out in a very sarcastic way. Yes, you are the educated person here. You would be knowing that, and I am not aware of such an article, and so on. So he is the educated person here. However, he lacks understanding. And what kind of understanding here? He lacks the understanding of the complex dynamics of social structure. In other words, he failed to understand the circumstances of the peasant here. So we can say that he lacks understanding. And in fact, he did not consider the circumstances of the culprit at all. He called it as a nuisance. He said that Dennis is interrupting the court session and so on. So all these kind of things that we see in the magistrate. In other words, Anton Chekhov is trying to criticize the social structure of the day. And if you can look at the high-handedness of how he settled the case, is that he even called Dennis an idiot, a donkey, and he was even misled into thinking that Dennis was simply pretending or feigning ignorance here. So now let's take a look at the elements and, or we can say the snippets of what exactly happened in that courtroom. The author, remember, he had used a lot of satire, and through that literary device, he has ridiculed and exposed and criticized social norms or vices. Remember, we are, through the perspective of Dennis, we get to understand the condition of the peasants, and also we get to understand how law can favor the rich people more than the poor people. There is a lot of humor. The elements of humor is really good here, and that element was being brought out through the communication gap that took place in between the peasant and the magistrate. And in fact, a lot of misunderstanding took place. I've already pointed out one. And in fact, if you can also take a look at the question which Dennis pointed out, can I go now? He does not really understand why he's been brought to the court. So he thought that he is innocent. He could not understand that simply by unscrewing a single nut in the railway track can cause a lot of damage. In fact, if you look at the article here, interestingly, the article says anyone who intentionally, in other words, intentionally here means deliberately, scheming. But if you look at the case of Dennis here, he understands the gravity of what would happen. So that's why he put it out as, yes, I understand. That's why we do not remove the nuts in one place altogether. We do it in such a way that it does not brought or cause harm. So see, that kind of a statement suggests that he understands the gravity, but he does it consciously, and his intention is that his intention was not to bring harm or cause an accident. So that kind of a facet to the story here through the perspective of Dennis is interesting, and it has also brought out a lot of humor. The fact that he looked at the magistrate incredulously, unbelievingly, that he is to be sent to prison. He asked, whatever for? If I had committed a crime, if I have committed a theft, then I can be sent to the prison. In fact, he also humorously pointed out that he has no time to go to prison. He has to go to a fair. And if anybody has to be sent to prison, it is the people such as the bailiff, who is muddling the accounts of his tenants. Or we can also say the person, the watchman who also bashed him up when he was caught unscrewing that nut. So all these kind of argument led us to understand that it is not only Dennis who is at fault here. In fact, in a very humorous way, Dennis also, since he made a livelihood out of, he's a fisherman, in fact, so how the whole village depends on that nuts, all right, and how everyone is involved one way or the other in unscrewing those kind of nuts in order to sell it, to make weight for their fish nets. So we get an interesting picture of the village, the peasants who were struggling. So it also brought out a lot of humor, no doubt, at the same time a lot of reflection on the peasant's situation. Now he is a simpleton, an ignorant person, we can also say, with a very loose tongue, versus a law enforcer who is strict and who looked at evidence and facts only. The magistrate questioned, is this the nut? And again, like I said, that's how the humor was brought about. You cannot really identify which nut exactly it is. And then again, we also find the humorous tone here when the magistrate said that hold your tongue, in other words, do not interrupt. Dennis goes and say, I am holding my tongue as it is, So all these kind of situations create a lot of humor. Then, of course, because of the loose tongue of Dennis, he is the defendant here, but eventually he also admitted that he unscrewed those nuts, and eventually he also admitted that crime, unknowingly, we can also say. So again, that is also humorous. At the same time, one thing led to another. He talks about the fishermen, he talks about the village people who are involved, he talks about the bailiff and so on. So, in fact, the funny thing here is that he even questioned the magistrate. So those are the humorous elements that we see here, and those are the context that we understand from this story. There are also a lot of irony. In fact, those humorous tones are also part of the irony here. Dennis' failure to recognize his role as a defendant and his loose tongue eventually led him to admit his crime, but in the process revealed the core social issues. His utter disbelief when he was said to be guilty. If I were to carry, he argued, if I were to carry a rail away or even put a lock across the track, yes, we understand, we don't unscrew them all, we always leave some, we do it carefully, we understand, fools do not obey laws, all those kind of things. It also brought out a lot of irony. And in fact, he also goes on and said that or appeal to the judge, or he also goes and appealed to the magistrate, saying that be reasonable, one should be reasonable, one should reason first, one should judge first before beating up someone. So all those kind of things brought out humor and irony in the lesson here. You have been educated, one ought to judge first and drag afterwards, appealing to the magistrate on reason or to be reasonable. And his ignorance of the law is also another important thing that we need to consider. We people live in the darkness, you know better. Why should I lie? Everyone in the village knows about it. Everyone in the village, even a young child, knows about the importance of those nuts to attach to the fish nets in order to make weight and so on. You see, this kind of explanation also brought a lot of irony and humor. So, who is the malefactor, or who is the real culprit here? Is it Dennis? Is it Ivan Akinov, who is the watchman who beat up the peasant? Is it Mitrovan Petrov, who bought or who buys and make fish nets? Is it the bailiff who muddled his accounts, cheating, in other words, the peasants? Is it his brother Kuzma who won't pay the rent? As he was being dragged out of the courtroom, he also pointed out that I should not be responsible for my 3 brothers. Kuzma never paid his rent and so on. So maybe that's why he needed to go and unscrew those nuts. Does the law consider the circumstances? If you look at the case here, does the law consider the circumstances? We need to weigh that out as well. Was the crime intentionally done? Is it Dennis who is intentionally unscrewing those nuts in order to create an accident? Is it just to arrest someone for unscrewing a nut? So all these kinds of inferential that should be done on your part will give you the conclusion as to whether it is justified or not. And we would find that Dennis, you would also come to reason that whether Dennis is innocent or not, and whether justice was being served in that courtroom or not. So the big question here, was justice being served? The law does not consider rich or poor, as we can see here. It only looks at the facts and evidence. But is it enough to simply look at the facts and evidence? Is Dennis innocent? Was it intentional, as the articles say? We need to reflect back on that. So those kind of answers would give you the clue whether he is innocent or not. Yes, in certain cases, we felt that Dennis is also trying to pretend to have no idea about all these kind of things. You need to also reflect on the complex dynamics of the society here. Remember, I've mentioned about the social hierarchy here, the high-handedness on the part of those people who are in authority, and also the plight or the situation of the peasants here. So again, we come back to the question, is it just to sentence a peasant for imprisonment on account of unscrewing a nut? So this is what Anton Chekhov, in a very clever way, put it across to the reader. And you need to weigh it out from the point of view of Dennis and also from the point of view of the magistrate here. So that would give you clue as to whether come to an understanding or conclude whether justice was being served or not. And on that note, we would be winding up today's class. Thank you all very much for joining me.